Hello there, my name is Dipti Tait. I am the author of Good Grief, A Companion to Change and Loss. Now, grief is a subject that's very close to my heart. Um, Most people think that grief is something that you go through when somebody dies in your life, but actually, that's not true. My belief is that we are all grieving something, but we might not know it's called grief. Now, what I would like to talk to you about is how to work with grief. But first of all, we need to identify what exactly grief is. Now, I describe grief as an intense, overwhelming feeling of emotions. So these emotions could range from intense sadness, anxiety, loneliness, feelings of being isolated, perhaps feelings of guilty about something, um, even denial and shock can be feelings from grief, and also depression, feeling very, very low in your mood and not really knowing the reason why. So there are quite a lot of emotions that are linked to grief, and unfortunately, they don't all come in a sequential order. So you go, aha, there's grief. They can come in and out of your world and your awareness out of the blue when you're not expecting them to. Now, why does grief give us intense emotions? Well, that's an interesting question, but we don't know why. It's just the way of your brain and your body doing its thing to process. Now, anger could be another emotion. So sometimes you might feel overly angry or irritated about something and not really know the reason why. Now, as I've said before, it's not just death that causes feelings of grief. It could be any type of significant loss or change in your world. So, something that's different to what you actually know, different to your routines, different to what you expect. Anything that significantly changes out of the blue, perhaps, can cause these feelings of intense overwhelm. That's why I wrote my book, because I didn't know I was grieving at the time. I lost both my parents to cancer, and at the time I was working at the BBC, so I was in a huge corporation environment, and obviously when you're at work, it's not very appropriate to show overly emotional states of mind. So, emotional overwhelm isn't very encouraged in a workplace. So I didn't know what to do with all of this emotion. So basically, I recognized that there was something not quite right because I'm not a very overly emotional person normally. So I did a lot of research and a lot of looking inwards, and that's where the book comes from. So it's just helping you identify what grief is, what it feels like, what you can do about it, and how you can get help. So, this is how to work with grief, to make grief work with you. It's not about shutting it away. It's not about denying it. And it's not about trying to suppress it at all. Because actually, if we start to do things like that, it will just go back into your system and then rear its head another time. So it is about going through the process. And the only way through grief is to grieve. So, in my world, I really want to help you understand grief and understand that it's something that you can deal with by easily chunking it down so it doesn't feel so intense and it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Now, let me give you a few examples of how we can feel grief. So, it could even be things like changing of your job. So, when your environment changes, what you've known to be kind of usual and routine. So, moving and relocating can cause grief. Even things like illnesses, and adjusting to the new kind of awareness around your illness and loss of your health, that can cause feelings of grief. Even things like relationships breaking down, not just personal relationships, but also professional relationships, divorces, partnerships ending, that kind of thing. Um, your children leaving home, and so therefore you've got to adjust to a different type of lifestyle. That can cause grief. Any sort of change in your family circumstances, even having babies, because you've kind of gone from one sort of lifestyle to another, leaving the workplace, loss of your identity, changing in your career, a new chapter or a different type of lifestyle that can cause feelings of grief. And also, again, retirement, things like finishing a kind of chapter in your life. You kind of can lose that loss of feeling of personal identity. Who am I? So there's quite a lot that can trigger feelings of grief. Now, what can we do about it? Well, first of all, I believe it's about understanding grief, understanding that you're not going mad, you're not losing your marbles, your kind of mental health is relatively stable. You may need support with it. You may need to ask for help. You may need to perhaps look at alternative options of how you can support your emotional overwhelm. But at least if you know it's grief, then you feel better because you can categorize it into something that makes sense. So that's really what my work is all about, really, is to help people understand what grief is, and just to understand that if you know you're going through grief, there are some strategies that can help you. Okay, so what are some of these strategies? Well, first of all, one of the interesting kind of beliefs that we adopt when we feel like we're grieving is that we are alone, that nobody else will understand what we're going through, that this is a feeling that no one else has ever felt before. So it's kind of my way of saying you feel lonely in a crowded room. But I want you to first of all understand that you are not alone, that actually there is always some help out there. So it's just about finding a way for yourself to reach out for that help. Now, this could be talking to a colleague, it could be talking to your boss, it could even just be finding a way to sort of figure out a solution for yourself. So it is just about recognizing that you are not alone. That's my first way of resourcing grief. The second thing that I would say is that understanding that what you are going through is normal. So, absolutely recognizing that grief is a process that happens to all of us human beings. There's a lovely quote actually, and it's we have the capacity to grieve if we've had the capacity to love. So if we have loved something, or we've enjoyed something, or we've got a lot out of something, and then that disappears, then of course there's going to be a hole that's left, and in that hole is what I'm calling grief. So it's just about managing that awareness and recognizing that it is normal, that there's no shame in grieving. But when you understand that that is what you're going through, then that can start to feel better because you know that you've defined it in a way, and then at least you can find a solution towards it. Another way of describing grief is that imagine that in your brain you have something called a little bucket of stress. So you've got a little stress bucket sitting in your brain. Now, normal everyday usual stresses are sort of like tiny little pebbles that get into the bucket. And, we can kind of deal with these pebbles because they're sort of small enough to break them down. However, grief is like a massive boulder that gets into your bucket. So it's a massive thing that feels unmanageable. So that's why it feels like it's intense and it feels like it's overwhelming, because your brain doesn't really know what to do with this massive lump of kind of stuff, really. So that's why it's really important to understand that there is a process of chipping away at that lump, and eventually it will start to reduce. Now, we don't want to make that grief go away immediately, because there is a reason for it. It's helping your brain process something, it's helping your brain get used to an idea, something that's different. It's kind of processing the new, the change, if that makes sense. So there is extreme value in grief. And really, my work is all about helping people turn bad grief into good grief. Now, your brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. Our imagination can be so powerful and can work in such a strong way that perhaps we don't know the difference between what we've imagined and what is actually going on at the same time. Let me give you an example of that. So, what I'd like you to do now is imagine that you have a lemon in front of you, one of those really big, juicy Sicilian lemons. Now imagine that you've got that lemon on a chopping board and you're about to chop it up into chunks or into slices. So you chop it up into slices, and then I want you to pick up one of the slices and start to put it near your mouth. So imagine now that you've got that lemon in your mouth and you're ever so slightly squeezing the juice out of that lemon so you can now taste the juice in your mouth. So I wonder what is happening in your mouth right now. I wonder whether your salivary glands started to activate, because if they did, that shows you that your imagination is so powerful that you've actually managed to change some sort of physiology without anything really physically there. There is really no lemon. You've imagined the lemon so well that your brain has made up the rest for you. So, if we know our imagination works in this very, very powerful way, we can actually start to use our imagination in a beneficial way to help us rather than hinder us. We're using the imagined reaction of the grief, and we're helping the client move through that grief and helping them imagine something that's more preferred, that's something that will move them forward in a beneficial way rather than hold them back and keep them stuck. So that's really about what grief is, how to identify it, and then how to manage it. So, really helping you work with grief. So, I hope this has been helpful for you. But for now, it's been really lovely chatting to you, and I hope you have a really good rest of your day. Take care. Bye bye.